The letter came on a Tuesday, and I remember thinking, before I'd even opened it, that I already knew what it was going to say. The way you know a chest X-ray is bad before the radiologist says a word, just from how long they've been staring at it. Property insurance renewal. My home in Sarasota, paid off free and clear 11 years earlier, the one I'd planned to die in. The number on that page had gone from $4,600 to just over $13,000 in a single year. No claims filed, no damage, nothing except the general condition of being a house near water in the state of Florida in this particular decade. I sat at my kitchen table with that letter for a long time, and something in me, some part that had spent 35 years making calm, fast decisions under pressure, simply said, out loud to an empty kitchen, no. That's the actual beginning of this story. Not a beach, not a brochure, just a number on a page that didn't make sense anymore. If you're new to this channel, subscribe, because I go into detail like this every week. The real math behind these decisions, not the highlight reel. My name is Michael Thompson. I'm 67 years old and I practiced family medicine for 35 years, the last 22 of them in Sarasota, Florida. At a practice I eventually came to co-own with 2 partners. I delivered babies who later brought me their own babies. I sat with more families in more hospital rooms than I can count, some of the worst nights of their lives. And I don't say that for sympathy. I say it because it matters to what happened later. Medicine, real medicine, the kind where you actually know your patients, was the thing I built my entire identity around for over 3 decades. I never married, no children of my own. Though I'd occasionally joke that I had several thousand of them scattered across Sarasota County who called me Dr. Thompson at the grocery store. I sold my practice at 65, planned to retire quietly in the house I'd bought in 2013, right on a canal, boat lift and all, and simply enjoy the version of Florida I'd been promised my whole working life. I want to tell you about one particular Tuesday in my last year of practice, because it explains more about why I eventually left medicine, and then left Florida than any statistic could. A woman named Eleanor, 58 years old, came in with mild, intermittent chest discomfort that every clinical instinct I'd built over 3 decades told me was almost certainly musculoskeletal, a pulled muscle from moving furniture 2 days earlier. 20 years prior, I would have examined her, reassured her, told her to come back if anything changed. And been right, because I usually was. In my last year, I instead spent 40 minutes documenting a differential diagnosis, ordered an EKG, a troponin panel, and a stress test referral. Not because my clinical judgment had changed, but because a single missed cardiac event, however statistically unlikely, now carried consequences that could end a career built over 35 years. Eleanor's tests all came back normal, exactly as I'd expected on site. She left with a bill for several $100s in unnecessary testing, and I left that appointment feeling like a technician managing risk instead of a doctor. That feeling, repeated daily, in increments too small to notice individually, is what actually burned me out. Long before any insurance letter arrived. That promise didn't survive contact with the actual numbers. My insurance wasn't an isolated incident. And I want to be precise about this because precision is a habit medicine never lets you fully abandon. Florida's average homeowner's insurance premium had climbed past $5,600 a year even before my particular renewal, the highest in the country, driven by hurricane losses, reinsurance costs, and illegal climate insurers describe, not always fairly, as litigious. Property taxes on my house had risen with each new assessment. And beyond the money, which I could technically still absorb, there was a second calculation I found myself running, one that had nothing to do with dollars. Every June through November, I found myself checking storm trackers with a kind of low-grade dread I'd never admit to a patient complaining of anxiety. I'd spent 35 years telling people that chronic stress erodes the body in ways they can't see. I finally had to apply that same diagnosis to myself. I researched the way I've researched everything in my life, methodically, with actual sources, instead of assumptions. I read about Portugal, Panama, Costa Rica, And eventually Mexico kept surfacing for one specific reason that mattered enormously to a physician: proximity to real medical care and to my remaining family, a sister in Atlanta I intended to keep seeing regularly. I looked hard at the popular retirement corridors first: Lake Chapala, San Miguel de Allende, the places every article recommends. And there's nothing wrong with any of them. But something in me, maybe the same instinct that used to make me distrust an overly smooth diagnosis, wanted somewhere quieter, somewhere that hadn't already been fully discovered and priced accordingly. A colleague's brother, a retired anesthesiologist, had spent a few winters in a small fishing town on the Jalisco coast called Barra de Navidad. And when I looked into it, I found a town of roughly 4,300 people built on a narrow spit of sand between a lagoon and the open Pacific cobblestone streets, working shrimp boats coming in every morning, and none of the resort towers you'd find 3 hours north in Puerto Vallarta. I flew down for a scouting trip in February, stayed 10 days, and made a habit every morning of walking the length of the Malican before the heat set in, watching fishermen unload the night's catch onto the same weathered dock their fathers had probably used. I remember standing there on day 3, watching a man mend a net with the unhurried precision of someone who'd done it 10,000 times, and thinking, this is the opposite of a storm tracker app. This is a place organized around tides and seasons instead of premium renewals. I want to be honest, the decision wasn't purely romantic. I ran the numbers on this too. A comfortable one-bedroom rental near the lagoon in Barra runs $500 to $700 a month, a fraction of what I'd been paying just in insurance and taxes on the Sarasota house. And my temporary resident visa qualified easily on a physician's retirement income, which the consulate confirmed required proving roughly $4,400 a month, a threshold my pension and savings cleared without difficulty. I sold the Sarasota house in the spring, and I'll admit that was harder than any of the financial math suggested it would be. 35 years of a medical career leaves artifacts everywhere: diplomas, thank you cards from patients I'd delivered as infants decades earlier, a stethoscope I'd genuinely considered retiring alongside me. I kept exactly one box of those things. Everything else I either donated or sold. And by June I was standing in an empty apartment in Barra de Navidad with that single box and a suitcase, feeling something I hadn't expected to feel at 67, which was something close to the nervous excitement of my first year of residency. I want to be clear about something I promised myself before I ever boarded that flight south. I was done practicing medicine. Not resentfully done, not burned out in the dramatic sense you sometimes hear about, just genuinely, deliberately finished. 35 years is a long time to carry other people's emergencies in your own body. And I told myself, quite firmly, that Barra de Navidad was going to be the place where I was simply Michael, not Dr. Thompson, where nobody's chest pain was my responsibility at 2 a.m. ever again. I lasted 11 weeks. The first months were exactly what I'd hoped for. I learned the rhythm of the town quickly. Mornings on the Malican. Coffee at a small palapa restaurant where the owner, a woman named Guadalupe, started having my order ready before I sat down by about my second week. Afternoons reading on my small balcony overlooking the lagoon, watching pelicans dive for fish with a violence that never stopped being entertaining. I made a few acquaintances, mostly other retirees, a handful of Canadians who'd been wintering there for years, and treated the town with the proprietary affection of people who consider themselves regulars rather than tourists. I want to comment down below and tell me honestly, how many of you have tried to fully retire from a career that defined you? And how long it actually lasted before something pulled you back toward it? The moment that changed everything happened on an ordinary Thursday afternoon in late August. I was walking back from the Mercado with groceries when I heard shouting near the small municipal dock, the specific pitch of voices that any physician learns to recognize instantly as genuine emergency rather than ordinary commotion. A young fisherman, maybe 19 years old, had gotten his hand caught in a winch line hauling in nets. And by the time I pushed through the small crowd that had gathered, his forearm was bleeding heavily, and he was going pale in a way I recognized immediately as early shock. There was no ambulance coming anytime soon. The nearest real hospital was in Manzanillo, 45 minutes away on a good day, and the small local health post had a single nurse who was clearly out of her depth with an injury this severe. I didn't think. 35 years of training doesn't ask permission. I set my groceries down, identified myself in the careful Spanish I'd been practicing, and got to work. Direct pressure, elevation, a makeshift tourniquet from someone's belt when the bleeding wouldn't slow enough. Keeping the boy talking to monitor his mental status, while someone found a truck to get him to Manzanillo. I rode in that truck bed with him the entire 45 minutes, one hand maintaining pressure, watching his vitals the only way I could without equipment, by watching his face, his breathing, the color returning slowly to his lips as the bleeding finally controlled. He kept the arm. I found that out 4 days later when his mother, a woman I'd never met, showed up at my apartment with a dish of pozole and cried on my doorstep for a solid 5 minutes, before either of us said a coherent word. That single afternoon exposed something I'd been quietly ignoring since I arrived. Barra de Navidad, for all its charm, had almost no real medical infrastructure. One overworked nurse at a small government health post. No resident doctor, no functioning emergency response beyond whoever happened to own a truck that day. The nearest genuine hospital care meant a 45-minute drive on a road that, during rainy season, wasn't always passable quickly. I'd spent 35 years treating patients in a country with, whatever its flaws, an entire emergency infrastructure I'd simply never had to think about. Ambulances, trauma centers, helicopters if it came to that. Here, the entire system in a genuine emergency was whoever happened to be standing nearby and knew what to do. I sat with that knowledge for about 2 weeks, telling myself, again, that I was retired, that this wasn't my responsibility, that I'd earned the right to simply drink coffee and watch pelicans for the remainder of my working years on this earth. That argument lost. I approached the local health post nurse, a genuinely dedicated woman named Araceli who'd been running that post essentially alone for 6 years, and asked her a simple question: what would actually help? Her answer surprised me with its specificity. Not grand gestures. A weekly clinic where basic chronic conditions, diabetes, hypertension, the unglamorous daily work of medicine, could actually be monitored properly instead of managed in emergency bursts whenever things got bad enough to notice. I started an informal Tuesday clinic 4 months after arriving. Nothing official, no fee. Set up in a spare room at the health post with equipment I purchased myself and supplies Araceli sourced through her existing channels. Word spread the way it does in a town of 4,300 people, which is to say almost instantly. My first Tuesday, 6 patients showed up. By the 3rd month, I was seeing 25 to 30 people every week, checking blood pressure, adjusting diabetes medications, catching a cardiac arrhythmia in a 70-year-old fisherman that would have killed him within the year had it gone undetected. I don't say that last part to sound heroic. I say it because it's the plainest illustration of what an entire town had been missing. What struck me most, and this is the part I genuinely didn't anticipate, was how different the actual practice of medicine felt here, compared to my last decade in Florida. Back in Sarasota, by the end, a huge percentage of my mental energy went toward things that had nothing to do with healing anyone. Documentation requirements calibrated more toward liability than care. Prior authorization calls with insurance representatives who'd never examined a patient in their lives. The constant low hum of malpractice awareness sitting behind every decision I made, whether I wanted it there or not. In that spare room at the Barra de Navidad health post, none of that existed. I saw a patient, I talked to them, actually talked, for as long as the conversation genuinely needed, and I treated what was in front of me. It felt, for the first time in probably 15 years, like the actual reason I'd gone into medicine in the first place. I don't want to romanticize this into something it isn't. The limitations are real and I confront them every single week. I don't have a functioning lab on site, so anything requiring blood work means coordinating a trip to Manzanillo, and patients without transportation sometimes simply don't go. I've had to become fluent enough in Spanish medical terminology to conduct real clinical conversations, which took genuine humbling effort at 67. sitting with a tutor twice a week, feeling exactly as awkward as any first-year student. And there are nights I lie awake worrying about a patient the same way I did for 35 years in Florida. Proof that you can change your zip code, but you can't fully retire the particular species of worry that comes from actually caring whether someone lives. The Spanish took real work, and I want to be honest about how humbling that process was for a man who'd spent 35 years being the most knowledgeable person in almost every room he entered. My tutor, a retired teacher named Profesora Lupe, had me practicing basic phrases like "Dende le duele?" Where does it hurt? Alongside far more technical vocabulary: arrhythmia, hypertension, insufficiencia. Terms I needed precisely right, because a mistranslated symptom in medicine isn't a minor embarrassment. It's a genuine risk to a patient. I made real errors early on. In my second month running the clinic, I nearly misunderstood a patient describing dizziness as a digestive complaint, because I'd confused two similar-sounding words, and Araceli, patiently, without a hint of condescension, corrected me on the spot. I've come to genuinely value working alongside someone secure enough in her own competence to correct a physician twice her senior without hesitation. That kind of directness, I've noticed, runs through this entire town. I also enrolled in Mexico's public health system IMSS on a voluntary basis myself, both because it was sensible personal planning at 67 and because I wanted first-hand understanding of what my patients without private coverage were actually navigating. The annual premium at my age runs a few $100s, dramatically less than any private American plan. And while the system has real limitations, waiting periods for non-emergency specialist care being the most obvious. The fundamental architecture, care available regardless of your ability to pay up front, struck me as something my own country never quite managed to build in 35 years of trying. One Tuesday in my 6th month stands out, and I think about it often. A mother brought in her daughter, maybe 8 years old. With a wheeze I recognized instantly as moderate asthma, poorly controlled. The kind of thing that's routine in any American pediatric practice, but that this family had simply been managing with home remedies, because they'd never had access to a doctor who could properly diagnose it. I had a single inhaler in my supply kit, donated by a pharmaceutical rep contact I'd kept from my Florida years, and I taught the mother how to use it, adjusted the girl's positioning, watched her breathing ease within minutes in a way that still, after 35 years, gives me a small private thrill every time it happens. The mother, whose name was Yolanda, started crying, the quiet kind, and told me her daughter had been struggling like this for over a year. I've since arranged, through a contact at a Guadalajara hospital, a standing donation of pediatric inhalers for the clinic, and that single case is the reason. I've also found myself woven into the town's rhythms beyond the clinic itself. Barra de Navidad and its sister town, Melaki, celebrate Semana San Patricio each March, a week-long festival honoring Irish soldiers who settled the area generations ago. And my first year, Araceli essentially informed me, rather than asked me, that I'd be attending. I stood in the plaza that week watching fireworks over the lagoon, a beer in hand, surrounded by people who a year earlier had been strangers, and who now greeted me by name. Several of them former patients. One of them the young fisherman whose arm I'd helped save, grinning and very much intact, introducing me to his own mother as El Doctor que me salve, the doctor who saved me. I didn't correct the phrasing, though clinically a great deal of that credit belonged to whoever built that truck's engine and got us to Manzanillo in time. There's a moment most Tuesdays now that I've come to genuinely treasure. Around 6 in the evening, after the last patient has left, Araceli and I sit outside the health post with coffee, watching the fishing boats come back in for the day. The same boats, likely, that the young man with the winch injury still works on. She asked me once, in her careful, improving English, why a retired American doctor would spend his supposed rest years doing exactly what he'd supposedly retired from, unpaid, in a language he was still learning. I told her the truth, which took me longer to arrive at than I expected it would. I didn't retire from medicine because I stopped caring about it. I retired from the version of medicine that had slowly buried the actual practice under paperwork and liability and insurance company phone trees. Here, in a spare room in a fishing town most Americans have never heard of, I finally got the job back that I'd actually trained for. I still get storm alerts on my phone, old habits, and this coast isn't immune to hurricane season any more than Florida was, though the frequency and severity here run measurably lower than what I'd grown accustomed to on the Gulf side. But I no longer check those alerts with dread. I check them the way everyone in this town does, with practical attention and then a return to whatever the day actually holds. Last week, that meant a 68-year-old woman named Doa Carmen, coming in for her regular blood pressure check, sitting across from me the way patients used to before medicine got complicated, telling me at length about her granddaughter's upcoming wedding while I listened to her heart. And for a few minutes. That was the entire job. Just a doctor and a patient in a room. Nothing standing between us. People sometimes ask me, usually other American retirees I meet passing through, whether I regret leaving a paid-off house on a Florida canal for a rented apartment above a lagoon in a town most of them had to look up on a map. I never have a quick answer for that, because the honest one takes longer than small talk usually allows. I didn't leave Florida because I stopped loving the state that gave me my entire career. I left because the version of both retirement and medicine it was offering me by the end had stopped resembling either word's original meaning. Retirement was supposed to mean rest, not a spreadsheet recalculated every hurricane season. Medicine was supposed to mean healing people, not managing institutional risk on their behalf. I found both of those original meanings again, unexpectedly, in a spare room next to a health post, in a fishing town of 4,300 people, who never asked me for a single form of documentation before deciding to trust me. I'm Michael Thompson. Thank you for listening to Retired in Mexico.